Welcome to Say the Question. I'm Joe, and with me is Sam. Today we're getting into listening to respond, or, more honestly, whether people say they're listening when they're really just loading up their next answer.
Yeah, because conversation is supposed to be about understanding, but a lot of the time it feels like both people are secretly drafting their comeback while the other one is still talking.
That's the awkward part, right? And the real starting take is this. In normal conversation, response planning happens fast. So let's separate the built-in timing of talk from the bad habit of not actually hearing someone. Sam, start us off.
I think a lot of people use "I'm listening" as a shield. Not always as a lie, exactly. Sometimes it's just social camouflage while they wait for their turn.
That's the suspicious version, yes. The cleaner claim is probably this. A lot of people listen to prepare a response, not to understand. Those are not the same thing. And one of them is way less honest than it sounds.
Right, and the annoying part is they can look attentive while doing it. Nodding, making eye contact, saying, "I hear you." And somehow the actual point never really lands.
Real listening is supposed to be about understanding first. The basic version is pretty simple. You hear what someone said, think about what it means, and check back to make sure you got it the way they intended.
So the question isn't whether they made the right face at the right time. It's whether they actually made room for the other person's point.
Exactly. And making room can look boring. Sometimes it means asking one clarifying question instead of jumping in with your own fix, your own story, or your own little summary of why you're right.
Which is where it gets suspicious. Because people act generous, but half the time they are just waiting for a pause big enough to drop their opinion on top of yours. Joe, am I overstating that?
A little, but the pattern is real enough. Conversation gets treated like defense, performance, or competition way more often than people admit. And those three modes all make listening look more generous than it is.
Defense is the one I notice most. Somebody hears something slightly unfair, and instantly they're managing their image instead of hearing the complaint. You can almost feel them reaching for the clean version of themselves.
Yeah, or they're listening for the one word they can disagree with so they can ignore the rest. That's not always malicious. Sometimes it's habit. Sometimes it's fear. Sometimes it's just bad conversational hygiene.
And sometimes it's a total fake out. They say, "I see your point," and the rest of the sentence is just their point in a fake mustache.
That version definitely exists. But if we want the honest question, it's not, are people secretly evil listeners? It's, when is listening being used as a stall tactic? And what are the signals that someone is actually trying to understand?
A very normal version is dinner table stuff. Somebody tells a story, another person waits for the breath, then jumps in with their own story that only barely connects. Everybody calls that a conversation, but it's really just two people taking turns to steer.
Yeah, and you can feel the difference when someone is actually tracking you. They don't just wait for the opening. They respond to the part you are trying to make. They might say, "So if I'm hearing you right, the issue isn't the policy, it's how it was handled." That is a real checkback.
That sounds almost too simple, which is usually how you know it's useful. Because if they can restate your point in a way you'd actually sign your name to, then at least they were in the conversation with you.
Right. And if they can't do that, they may still be polite, but they are not really listening in the sense that matters. Politeness is cheap. Accuracy is the part that costs something.
That's the distinction people try to blur. They want credit for being calm when the actual issue is whether they understood you. Calm is not the same as listening. A person can be very composed and still be mentally building a rebuttal the whole time.
Exactly. Listening to understand asks, what did you mean? Listening to respond asks, how do I keep my position intact? Sometimes those happen together, but when the second one is running the show, the first one becomes mostly theater.
And the theater part is why people get so annoyed by it, because they can feel when the other person is not really available. They're just waiting to come back with a cleaner line.
Which is why a good check isn't whether someone says, I hear you. It's whether they can answer the follow-up. What do they think you meant? What part do they disagree with? What part do they think might be true, even if they don't like it?
That's the part people skip. They want the credit line, not the work. They want to be seen as open-minded before they've done the open-minded part.
Yeah, but we should keep the fence in view here. This is not saying everyone is fake, and it's not saying a disagreement is proof of bad faith. A lot of decent conversations still have interruptions, half-formed replies, and people talking past each other without meaning to.
Fair. The useful standard is just, can you summarize the other person in a way they recognize, and did you leave enough space for that to happen? If not, you may have been participating, but you were not exactly listening.
Right. So the opening distinction is not good people listen and bad people don't. It's whether the listening is actually making room for the other person's meaning, or just keeping the conversation stable until it's your turn to take over. That gap is what we're really after.
Okay, but before we turn this into a moral trial, let's stay with the part that makes people suspicious. A lot of the time, I'm listening looks a lot like I'm waiting my turn. The face is polite, but the brain is already lining up to come back.
And that part is not imaginary. Conversation research treats listening and speaking as overlapping activities, not neat separate boxes, which is a very unromantic way of saying people often hear and prepare at the same time.
Right, and that's what bothers people. They think they're getting attention, but sometimes what they're getting is a person staying ready. Not always hostile, just mentally already half a step ahead of the actual conversation.
That's the annoying distinction. A person can be following your point and still be aimed at their next turn. That doesn't make them fake by itself. It means the mental gear shift is happening in real time, which is normal and also a little irritating.
Sure, but people aren't crazy for noticing the tells. They nod at the right places. They say, I hear you, and then they grab one word and drag the whole thing back to their angle. Or they restate your point just enough to move past it without touching the part that actually matters.
And that is exactly the behavior that makes people feel unheard. It is not just disagreement. It is the sense that the other person is listening for an opening rather than for meaning.
Sometimes it even feels like they're collecting fragments. They don't have to hear you fairly, just long enough to find the sentence they can swat away. That's when the whole thing starts to look strategic instead of conversational.
Not always, but that is exactly the problem.
Not always, I know, but that's the part people can feel instantly when it's happening. The room gets full of one person's future reply and way less of the other person's actual point.
That's the better way to say it. There's a difference between preparing a reply and pre-deciding the reply. One is just how conversation works. The other is when the speaker becomes background noise until you get your opening.
And that's where people start reading the room as fake. Somebody says, no, I get what you mean, but the next sentence proves they got enough to argue and not enough to understand. You can almost hear the person skipping the middle step.
That middle step matters more than people think. A basic listening model is hearing, understanding, critically evaluating, remembering, and then responding. The problem is that a lot of people act like response mode can stand in for the whole chain.
Yeah, and stress makes that worse. If somebody feels cornered, rushed, or embarrassed, they can start protecting themselves so hard that they stop taking in what's actually being said. That's not noble, but it's human.
Exactly. Invisible disagreement does not automatically mean someone failed to listen. Some people are just clumsy under pressure, or they're in a bad mood, or they're trying to keep the conversation from going off the rails.
So, what part of the suspicion is fair then? Are we talking about somebody who's bad at conversation, or somebody who already decided their own position is the only one that matters?
Mostly the first one, sometimes the second one, and people confuse them because the signals overlap. The fair version is, this looks like bad listening when somebody keeps redirecting, keeps flattening your point, or keeps answering a version of it that's easier to beat.
And if that happens enough, the other person stops trusting the whole interaction. They start assuming your nod means nothing, your means nothing, and your calm tone is just a nicer wrapper on the same refusal to engage.
That's the social damage, yeah. Once people think you're only there to defend yourself, every little cue gets read as theater. A pause looks fake, a summary looks selective, and a polite tone starts sounding like paperwork.
That last part is almost too real. There's a point where the person isn't hearing your sentence anymore. They're hearing your posture. And once that happens, the conversation turns into two people managing appearances.
Right, but we should not overcorrect into therefore everybody is manipulative. The stronger claim is smaller and uglier. Some people are genuinely listening, some are mostly preparing, and some are protecting themselves so hard they can't tell the difference anymore.
And that's why the suspicion sticks. The useful standard is whether you can restate the other person in a way they recognize and still leave enough room for their meaning to land. If not, you may be participating, but you're also probably managing the conversation more than understanding it. Okay, so now that we've admitted the suspicion is real, let's kill the lazy first answer. I hate the version that says nobody listens anymore. Like humanity woke up one day and collectively decided to become terrible at conversation.
That's the cleanest way to make yourself feel smarter than the room. Also, the least useful. Because once you say, everyone is always performing, you've explained everything and therefore nothing.
Right, and that's the trap. It sounds edgy, but it's actually kind of lazy. People hear that and go, well, I guess all conversation is fake. And then they stop asking the more annoying question, which is, fake in what way? For what reason?
Exactly. There's a big difference between bad manners and bad faith. Someone can be rude, distracted, defensive, insecure, tired, or just self-absorbed without being some master manipulator trying to win a secret war in the family group chat.
The family group chat is where sincerity goes to die, so that checks out. But seriously, people love to collapse all bad listening into villainy because it feels morally satisfying. If the other person is evil, then you never have to deal with the possibility that they're just fragile, embarrassed, or not very good at this.
And that matters because the cause changes the fix. If it's bad intent, you set a boundary. If it's habit, insecurity, or overload, you need a different move. Maybe they are protecting their ego. Maybe they are already thinking about their reply. Maybe they are just bad at staying with another person's point long enough to let it land.
So where do you draw the line then? At what point does their defensive stop being a fair read and start becoming a polite way to excuse somebody who is basically manipulating the room?
That's the useful question. I think the line is whether they can ever actually stay with your point when it costs them something. If they can hear a hard thing, reflect it back, and still respond like a person instead of a shield, that looks like defensiveness or habit. If they consistently reroute every conversation back to their comfort, then you're getting into something more intentional.
So the evidence is not just they interrupted me once and now I have a diagnosis. It's the pattern. Do they correct themselves? Do they ever let the other person's meaning survive contact with their own ego? Or does everything get converted into, here is why I am still right?
Yes, and the reason that matters is because being heard and being understood are not the same thing. People can nod, smile, repeat a keyword, and still never actually check whether they got the point. They can sound engaged while staying completely untouched by what you said.
Which is why the self-help version of this gets annoying fast. It turns every failed conversation into a poster about empathy, as if the problem is that nobody remembered the correct inspirational sentence. Sometimes the problem is simpler and uglier. The person likes being unchallenged, or they're too anxious to stay open, or the room rewards quick comebacks more than actual listening.
And the annoying part is that all three can be true in the same person. Someone can be insecure and also selfish. They can be careless without being malicious. And they can be strategic without turning into a cartoon villain. That's why the bad first answer fails in both directions. It makes everybody either a saint or a schemer.
That's the part I would keep. Not because it softens the criticism, but because it makes the criticism smarter. If somebody is only listening until they get to speak, that can be rude, cowardly, performative, or all three at once. You just don't get to pick the most dramatic label every time and call that insight.
Right. So the better read is not everyone is fake and not everyone is trying their best. It's what kind of failure is this? Is it ego, habit, fear, context, or actual bad faith? Those are different conversations, and if you mix them together, you end up blaming the wrong thing and fixing nothing.
Okay, so with the cheap cynicism stripped out, I think the split is pretty simple. Sometimes I'm listening means I want you to think I'm open while I keep my position safe. Other times it means I am trying, but my brain is already building a response because that's what humans do when they feel challenged. Those are not the same thing, and pretending they are makes the whole conversation mushy.
That's the useful fork. The darker reading is that listening language gets used as polite camouflage. You stay calm, you let the other person talk, and meanwhile, you're loading the counter-argument. People recognize that instantly because the posture is familiar. But the fairer reading is that disagreement makes real listening messy, because you can hear the words and still start organizing your answer at the same time.
And that first version shows up everywhere people are trying not to lose face. In relationships, at work, online. Go on, I'm listening. Can be a way to keep the floor while you decide how to swat the point away. Not always malicious, but definitely not
neutral. It's a management move. Still, the fair version matters because people can genuinely want understanding and still be bad at it in real time. There's conversation research showing listeners often start preparing responses before the current speaker finishes, and other work treats listening and taking the floor as overlapping processes. So from the outside, it can look like he's not listening, when inside, it's more like, I am listening, and I am also bracing.
That's exactly why this gets slippery. If you're talking to somebody you trust, you can often hear them thinking ahead and not take it personally, because you know they're not trying to bury you. But if it's a boss, a sibling fight, or a relationship argument where both people are already salty, the same behavior starts to look a lot less innocent. So what's the fair version of my suspicion then? Because I'm not trying to say every person in a disagreement is secretly running a scam. I'm saying the language of listening gets cheap fast when it mostly means I'm staying calm until I get my turn.
The fair version is that the phrase tells you almost nothing by itself. What matters is whether the person can check understanding before defending themselves. That's the cleaner standard. Not do they instantly agree with you, but can they tell you what you meant before they start fixing it, rebutting it, or escaping it?
That's the part people skip. Being heard and being understood are not the same thing, and neither one requires immediate agreement. But in a colder conversation, the gap between them matters a lot, because somebody can technically hear you and still not let anything you said change their internal map.
Right, and the distinction gets clearer in a close relationship versus an adversarial setting. If two friends are arguing about where to go on vacation, one of them may be drafting a reply while still trying to understand the other person, and that is just normal conversation friction. If it's a negotiation or a heated work meeting, the same behavior can become position defense fast, because now every sentence is being measured for what it gives away.
And that's why people get annoyed when they hear, I'm listening, but never see any sign the other person absorbed a single useful detail. You don't need instant agreement. You do need some evidence that the words made contact. A little summary, a real follow-up, even a small concession, something that shows the brain didn't just bounce the sentence off a shield.
Do you think the line is that simple, though? Because some people are genuinely slow processors. They may need a beat before they can restate your point cleanly. And if you judge them too fast, you end up calling them defensive just because they don't perform perfect listening in real time.
Fair. So the test can't just be timing, because some people are slower and some people are guarded. The cleaner test is whether they can come back with your point in a form you'd actually recognize, and whether they ask anything that shows they want the missing piece instead of just waiting to hit their talking points. If they do that, fine. That's real listening, even if they're still disagreeing.
That is the useful standard. Not perfect openness, not instant surrender, just enough contact that the other person's point can get inside the room before you start defending yours. If that never happens, then I'm listening is probably just a nicer way to say, I'm waiting.
Yeah, and once you look for that, the whole argument stops being about the word and starts being about the behavior. That's what we should watch for next. When listening is real and when it's just a costume for getting through the conversation unchanged. Okay, so before we turn this into a character indictment, what's the actual evidence here? My suspicion is obvious, but I want to know where the hard floor is.
The hard floor is pretty simple. Conversation is fast, and speech production takes time. People often have to start preparing a response before the other person is fully done, just to stay in the exchange.
So part of listening is actually your brain quietly drafting the next sentence while your mouth is still shut.
Exactly. And that is not automatically fake. There's research on turn-taking showing that when an utterance is predictable, listeners can prepare earlier, which means the structure of talk itself rewards fast response building.
That already makes the whole thing less morally tidy. It is not just one rude person zoning out. The format itself is nudging everyone toward, what am I going to say next?
Right, and there is related work on turn-taking that treats attention as partly strategic. In real talk, people are monitoring for the right moment to enter, not just absorbing speech like it got dropped into their lap.
I hate how reasonable that sounds, because it means the complaint cannot just be, people are bad listeners. It's that conversation naturally splits your attention between understanding and getting ready to step in.
That's the cleaner version. If you say, Humans are always multitasking in conversation. That's too broad. If you say, conversation makes room for response prepping, that's just true.
Joe, am I overstating it if I say the room itself trains people to watch for openings? I mean, not in a sinister way, just in a this is how the game works way.
No, that's fair. Even in triadic conversation, people are timing their attention around who is likely to speak next, which is another way of saying the social mechanics of talk are always part listening and part positioning.
And then the ugly part is what people do with that room. They do not just prepare a reply, they protect their position. They hear enough to know where the argument is going. And then they start building a fence.
Yeah, and different settings reward that in different ways. In workplaces, the person who answers fast can look sharper. On social platforms, speed can read as confidence, even when it is just a polished reflex.
There is also the meeting version of this. Somebody latches onto one phrase, jumps in with an answer, and suddenly they look engaged because they were first.
Or the group chat version, where everyone is technically present, but the real incentive is to be the one whose reply lands cleanly. The medium makes quick rebuttal feel like intelligence, even when it is mostly timing.
That's not exactly a flattering portrait of modern communication.
No, but it is incentive. If the room rewards quick rebuttal, people learn to treat attention like a launch sequence. That does not make everyone dishonest. It just means the environment trains a habit.
So what should we actually take from the receipts? Because I do not want to overclaim and say, aha, everyone is performing. But I also do not want to pretend the suspicion is just neurotic.
Take this. Fast reply planning is normal and sometimes useful. But if someone never checks your meaning, never restates your point, and never seems willing to be wrong on the spot, then the normal process has tipped into self-defense.
That is the useful line. Listening is not, I stayed quiet long enough to get my turn. Listening is, I can show you I got what you meant before I try to win the room.
And the real-world test is pretty plain. If someone says, hold on, let me make sure I have this right, that feels different from somebody who is only waiting for their own opening.
That is the part I keep coming back to. Not whether they had a thought ready, obviously they did, but whether they made any move to show they understood you before they protected themselves.
Exactly. And that is why this is not just a vibe complaint. The evidence gives us a better standard. Response prepping is normal, but check back is the tell that listening is still happening.
So the next question is not whether people ever think ahead. They do. It is what they do after that. Do they use the moment to understand you or just to keep their own footing?
Yeah, and once you use that standard, the next mess is all the ways people misread the complaint and defend the wrong version of it.
Okay, so if we've already agreed the room gets fake fast, the next move is to kill the lazy version of the complaint. Because people love to jump from that felt off to everybody is lying. And that shortcut is how you turn a decent observation into a stupid slogan.
The lazy version is usually some form of nobody listens, which sounds punchy, but it's way too broad to be useful. And it lets people feel morally superior without getting more precise.
The dumb version is basically, if you don't end up agreeing, you weren't listening, which is just a sneaky way of making agreement the test.
No, that's the wrong test. Listening is hearing what somebody means, checking that you got it right, and then deciding what you think about it.
Good, because otherwise we've turned every disagreement into a little court case where one side is always guilty of not being nice enough. So disagreement is allowed. Joe, am I making the standard too soft if I say the point is understanding, not surrender?
No, that's the useful version. Understanding is not surrender. The bar is lower and harder at the same time. Can you accurately restate the other person's point? And can you do it without instantly converting their words into fuel for your next reply?
That's the part people feel in real life. You can tell when somebody is technically present, but already halfway through their rebuttal. They're nodding in the right places, but the nod is doing a lot of work.
And that's where the better complaint lives. Not everyone is fake, and not every fast answer is bad, but a lot of conversations reward selective listening. People hear enough to protect their position, not enough to let the point actually land.
And the annoying part is, you don't have to love what they're saying to prove you understood it. You can say, I get your point, and I think it's wrong, which is apparently a rare skill.
That's the clean version. If you can restate the claim in a way the other person would recognize as fair, that's listening. If you only restate the weakest version you can swat away, that's defense with better PR.
Yeah, that's the ugly social truth. The point doesn't have to be ignored to be defeated. Sometimes it gets heard just enough to be boxed up, labeled, and filed under later, while somebody protects their angle.
And the framework that keeps that honest is pretty plain. Hearing words is not the same thing as tracking the point. And tracking the point is still not the same thing as making room for it to change your mind a little. That last part is optional in the sense that you can still disagree, but if nothing can move, then you weren't really listening so much as waiting.
Which, annoyingly, is what good listening often looks like. Slower, less dramatic, and way less flattering to the person doing it. It's a follow-up question, a real check for understanding, and then maybe a disagreement that actually lands on the same topic.
Exactly. So, the fair critique is not that no one ever listens. It's that a lot of people treat listening like a speed bump on the way to being right. And the culture keeps rewarding that version because it sounds efficient.
Okay, so the annoying part is we're not just dealing with bad listeners out there. We're in the system too. We reward the polished reply, the quick rescue, the person who sounds calm and smart, even if they barely absorbed a word.
That's the part people skip because it's uncomfortable. It's easier to say everyone else is shallow than to admit we also like the version of conversation where the other person makes us feel right, efficient, and not trapped in a long clarification.
Exactly. A lot of listening is really audience management. You're listening just enough to keep the relationship smooth, keep your status intact, or get through the meeting without having to think too hard.
And that doesn't automatically make it malicious. Sometimes it's just social survival. People are tired. They want efficiency. They want to avoid a fight. And they've learned that a fast, agreeable response usually works better than a careful one.
Sure, but that's the trap. We keep calling it good communication because it feels smoother. And then everyone walks away thinking they were heard when what actually happened was mutual damage control.
I'd soften mutual damage control a little, but the pattern is real. Conversation is fast and cooperative by default, so people get rewarded for being ready with a response. If the other person's line is predictable, you can start building your answer before they finish, which is great for speed and terrible for actual attention.
That's the cleaner version. So, the structure itself nudges you toward response prepping, which means the audience, the family, the workplace, whoever's in the room, all train each other to prefer the reply that lands cleanly over the reply that shows understanding.
Right, and you can hear it in the little social rewards. The person who says, "Yep, got it," and then instantly pivots to their point can sound more capable than the person who pauses, reflects back the concern, and asks one more question, even if the second person is doing the more honest work.
That's especially obvious in a family dinner or a work meeting. Somebody brings up a real worry, and one person gives the cleanest possible response just to end the discomfort. Everyone relaxes because the room got quieter, not because anything got understood.
Yeah, or the group chat version of it, which is maybe the most modern form of fake listening. Somebody sends a complicated complaint, and the replies are all variations of "totally fair" or "that sucks." And then the thread moves on. No one is being cruel. They're just trying to keep the conversation light enough to survive.
Joe, am I being too hard on people here, or do we all secretly prefer the version where someone sounds good over the version where someone is careful?
I think we do prefer it a lot of the time. Not always, and not in every context, but enough that it matters. In a tense conversation, agreeable sounding responses feel safer than a response that leaves the issue open and therefore slightly uncomfortable.
And then we act surprised when everybody gets good at fake listening. If the room rewards you for nodding, smiling, and staying vague, people will get very skilled at nodding, smiling, and staying vague. Humans are efficient like that, unfortunately.
That's not a character flaw in one person so much as a habit that gets reinforced. And it shows up everywhere. Families, offices, group chats, all those places where everyone says they want honesty, but mostly want the version of honesty that doesn't slow the room down.
Which is why the self-awareness part matters. It's not society in some giant abstract sense. It's us in small transactions, rewarding the polished dodge and then acting morally superior when the conversation feels empty.
And there's a nicer version of the standard than just accusing everyone of being fake. If you want real listening, you have to make room for the awkward pause, the follow-up question, the repeat back that isn't flattering but is accurate. Otherwise, you're basically asking for validation with conversational manners.
That's the useful test. Not did you look engaged, but did your next sentence change because you actually heard something? If the answer is no, then maybe you didn't listen. You just stayed polite long enough to keep your own position intact, which is a lot more common than people like admitting. Okay, so the landing is probably not people are fake, but something more annoying. Most I'm listening moments are mixed. People are usually taking in part of what you're saying and, at the same time, bracing their next move. That doesn't make every conversation a fraud. It just means attention and self-protection often show up together.
That's the part worth keeping. The mistake is turning every prepared response into a moral scandal, because response prepping is common. The real question is whether anything after that shows the person actually understood you, or whether they're just waiting for their turn to talk with better lighting.
Right, because if they never check back, never reflect it back, never ask the follow-up that proves they got the point, then I'm not impressed by the nodding. They may be polite, but polite is cheap. It costs almost nothing to look attentive while keeping your own position locked in.
Exactly. And that's where the conversation gets less mystical. You do not need to guess what's in someone's soul. You can look at what they do after you finish. Do they make room for correction? Or do they immediately flatten your point into
So what does
something
the honest
easier
test
to
look like
argue
then?
with? A decent test is whether they check their understanding before they defend themselves. If they say, "Let me make sure I got this right," or they give you back a version of your point that you'd actually recognize, that's real listening showing up in the room. It does not have to be perfect. It just has to prove your words landed before their reply took over.
And the fake version is usually obvious once you know what to watch for. You say, I think the meeting was a mess because nobody answered the actual question. And they come back with, so you're saying everyone there was incompetent? No, I'm saying you skipped the point because the point was inconvenient.
That's the fair version, though. I don't want to overstate it into some giant character flaw. Some people are distracted, some are anxious, and some are just bad at talking in real time. That doesn't make them villains. It does mean the conversation may never get past performance unless somebody is willing to slow it down a little.
Okay, but am I asking too much if I want the other person to restate the point before they disagree with it? Not a courtroom transcript, just enough of a mirror that I know they heard the thing I actually said.
No, that's the useful line. I'm not saying every conversation needs a formal recap like it's a hostage negotiation. I'm saying if somebody can never do that, even once, then they are probably protecting their position more than they are chasing understanding. That's the difference between an argument and a conversation that might actually go somewhere.
So the standard isn't, did they stay silent while I talked, or did they agree with me? It's, did they track what I said, check it, and leave any evidence that my point changed their next move at all? If the answer is no every time, you're probably not in a listening conversation. You're in a polite briefing.
That's the one I'd keep. Reward the follow-up that proves tracking. Reward the question that sharpens your point. Don't just reward the fastest comeback. And don't mistake smooth agreement for attention. The better signal is usually a little slower and a lot more specific.
And if you want the brutal little test, look for the sentence, let me make sure I have this right. If that's missing every time, the conversation might still be pleasant, but it's probably mostly self-defense with nicer manners, which honestly is how a lot of adult conversation gets dressed up.
That's the honest end of it. Real listening isn't rare because nobody has the ability. It's rare because it's socially expensive. It takes a little humility, a little pause, and the willingness to be changed before you speak again. That's enough of a standard to use tomorrow, which is probably the best kind of conclusion. And with that, we're done with this question. Thanks for spending a few minutes with Say the Question. Subscribe or follow, and we'll be back tomorrow.